They called her Lieutenant Liability. The whisper came from a resident passing the fourth-floor nurse's station at Mercy General in Atlanta, followed by the low snicker of a charge nurse who didn't bother looking up from her computer. Nobody meant it as a compliment. Nobody knew they were standing 3 feet away from someone who had carried a bleeding soldier 6 kilometers through enemy fire in Helmand Province, moving through the dark with nothing but starlight and the sound of her own heartbeat. They didn't know. They had no idea that the hands holding the 4 line on their unconscious patient in room for 47 had performed field amputations under incoming mortar fire, had sutured wounds that shouldn't have survived, had held a man's chest cavity together with nothing but gauze and muscle memory while waiting for a Black Hawk extraction that might never come. Brooke Sullivan pushed her long dark hair back from her face at 2,247 hours, 17 minutes into her 4th consecutive night shift, the fluorescent lights overhead casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made the human body look more like a problem to solve than a person to heal. The antiseptic smell hung in the air, sharp and chemical, cutting through the deeper baseline of sweat and old blood that never quite came out of the tile floor, no matter how much they scrubbed. She moved down the ICU corridor in soft-soled shoes that made no sound on the linoleum, checking her phone. Her fingers were steady. Her breathing was even. Her jaw was the only thing that gave her away sometimes, the way it would clench once, just once, when she heard the nickname repeated, when someone made an assumption, when the world reminded her that she had chosen to disappear. The Green Beret in room for 47 had been unconscious for 11 days. His chart read like a eulogy written by someone who'd given up: traumatic brain injury, multiple fractures, internal bleeding, complications from the surgery. No family contact. No emergency numbers. No visitors. His name in the system was John Doe, not the name of someone, but the name of nobody, the kind of designation reserved for bodies that don't have anyone left to claim them. Brooke had been assigned to his care on her first night shift because nobody else wanted the case. A patient with no family meant no complaints, no lawsuits, no emotional labor. Just maintenance. Just the routine checking of vitals that nobody would remember when the shifts changed. She noticed the tattoo during the 2,300-hour dressing change. His left forearm, still bruised with that deep purple that spoke of recent trauma, bore a name in block military lettering, Brooke Sullivan, and beneath it, GPS coordinates rendered in smaller text. The coordinates were precise: 34.7683 degrees north, 66.9398 degrees east, Helmand Province. The exact grid reference of the extraction point where she'd handed him off to the flight medics, both of them covered in blood that wasn't entirely hers, both of them half delirious with adrenaline crash and the particular horror of having been alive 5 minutes ago and almost not alive now. Her hands paused on the bandage she was replacing. 1 breath. 2. Then she continued working, her movements precise as a surgical laser, her expression revealing nothing. The challenge coin was in her locker in the break room on the 2nd floor, tucked beneath her civilian clothes and her extra scrubs, hidden in the same way she hid everything else about herself. She retrieved it at 0300 hours, during the quiet hours when the hospital became a skeleton of itself and only the night shift remained, the true believers who worked when most people slept. The break room was empty. The vending machine hummed its lonely electric song. She sat in the dark. She preferred the dark now, had preferred it for 2 years, and turned the coin over in her fingers, the metal worn smooth by the hands of men and women who had carried it into places where the difference between a living heartbeat and a dead one could be measured in seconds. The unit number was stamped on one side, barely visible in the dim light from the hallway bleeding through the break room window. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. 3/5. Dark Horse. That designation meant something to perhaps 2,000 people on the planet, and none of them knew where she was. None of them knew she was working night shifts in an Atlanta ICU, pushing medications and checking vitals and listening to staff members joke about patients they'd never see and families that would never call. She'd walked away because the nightmares had started winning, because the 3rd panic attack during a mass casualty drill had convinced her that staying was a liability, that her presence would endanger her team. So she'd disappeared. She'd become nobody. She'd become a nurse named Brooke Sullivan who'd learned to pull her hair back and smile politely and accept that the world would always underestimate her. The insomnia was back. It had been better for a few months, the exhaustion of civilian nursing finally outweighing the ghosts, but seeing the tattoo had cracked something open. She knew this patient. She knew the sound of his voice, low and steady, the kind of voice that came from a man who'd learned to speak quietly because the world was often very loud. She knew the exact shade of his eyes before the swelling had closed them, before the damage had turned him into this unconscious form that bore his name like a prayer for the living. It was during the search for the corrected inventory sheets at 0315 hours that she found the file room. She'd been looking for documentation on the 4 antibiotics being administered to room 427, a routine search that should have taken 5 minutes. Instead, she'd turned down a corridor she'd never noticed before, a hallway that curved away from the main ICU floor, and found a door marked restricted, authorized personnel only. The door was propped open. Inside, a small room with file cabinets and a desk, every surface organized with the kind of precision that spoke of control. She stepped inside without thinking. The habit of orders, of moving when an opportunity presented itself, died hard. She opened 3 folders before understanding what she was looking at, pharmaceutical inventory sheets, but the numbers didn't match the administration logs. Shipments from licensed distributors were being recorded, but the quantities weren't making sense. 50 units came in, but only 40 were accounted for in the hospital system. 100 vials of a research-grade immunosuppressant arrived, but the receiving documentation bore no patient names, no research authorization codes. They were being redirected somewhere else. Somewhere off the books. Dr. Blackwell's signature appeared on every redirect authorization. His name was written in that particular style of medical handwriting that hovers between genius and arrogance, sharp angles, no patience for the lowercase letters, the kind of signature that looked like someone signing the death warrants of mercy. That area is off limits, Nurse Sullivan. His voice cut through the fluorescent-lit silence like a scalpel through skin. She turned, her expression already arranged into apology, the particular humility that female nurses learn to perfect by their first month on the job. She didn't recognize the moment when his eyes shifted from casual disapproval to something much colder. She didn't see him making calculations. She didn't understand that she'd just made a decision for both of them by existing in the wrong place at the wrong time, by seeing something that was never meant to be seen, by representing a risk he would need to manage. "My apologies, Doctor," she said, her voice carrying that practiced softness that had become her armor. "I was looking for room for 27 antibiotics documentation. I'll find it elsewhere." She moved to leave, her hand steady, her breathing even. Behind her, Dr. Blackwell stood in the doorway and watched her go, his mind already working through the possibilities. The calculation of her usefulness versus her threat. The assessment of whether she'd understood what she'd seen. The rapid mental review of how isolated she was, how few people actually knew her, how easy it would be to begin a very small campaign to ensure that she understood the consequences of bearing witness. Within 24 hours, the reassignment notice appeared on Brooke's phone at 11:47 p.m. Not an email. A text from HR Director Patterson. Effective immediately. Night shift. Intensive care unit. Restricted system access, essential patient care only. No pharmacy requests. No laboratory ordering privileges. No access to patient records beyond her assigned bay. Staffing optimization, the official document said. She sat in her car in the Mercy General parking garage, hands gripping the steering wheel, breathing slowly through her nose. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like insects trapped in glass. She understood the message. Not in the words. In the speed. In the surgical precision of how quickly he'd moved. Blackwell didn't threaten. He isolated. He didn't yell. He methodically removed her access to information the way a surgeon removes a tumor, careful, calculated, leaving no trace of panic. The night shift began 3 days later. The ICU felt different in darkness. Quieter. The ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm, and the monitors beeped in steady patterns that could lull you into complacency if you weren't careful. Brooke was always careful. She moved between bays with the kind of practiced silence that came from 2 years of operating in the dark, both the hospital kind and the other kind, the kind where mistakes meant body bags. The other nurses ignored her. They didn't say anything cruel. Worse than cruelty was the nothing. One of them, Sandra from the day shift, made eye contact with Brooke once and looked away quickly, like she'd seen something she wasn't supposed to see. The message had already traveled through staff channels. Stay away from Sullivan. Her access is restricted. She's under review. Don't associate. On the fifth night, Brooke discovered her locker had been painted. Red spray paint, thick and sloppy, spelling out letters across the white metal door, Lieutenant Liability. The locker room was empty when she found it. 2:47 a.m. The shift change hadn't started yet, and the day staff had already cleared out hours before. She stood motionless, her hand reaching up toward the letters. Her fingers traced the edge of the L, feeling the raised paint texture. Someone had done this with intention. Someone had waited until the hospital was quiet. Someone had known the nickname from a patient file. Only one person had shown her that file. Brooke's jaw clenched once. She'd learned this technique in officer training: acknowledge the hit, don't bleed, move forward. She lowered her hand. Her face remained perfectly neutral, though her mind was already running through the logistics. Blackwell controlled access to the John Doe patient's restricted chart. He'd shown it to her deliberately, letting her see the coordinates. Now he was broadcasting that he knew she'd seen it. This wasn't intimidation. This was demonstration. This was him showing her the reach of his power. She photographed the locker with her phone, then grabbed her scrubs and changed for her shift. The evening ended without incident. By 5 a.m., the day staff had arrived and seen the red letters on her locker. Nobody mentioned it. Nobody looked at her. Sandra from respiratory walked past and kept her eyes fixed on the floor tiles like they were the most interesting thing in the hospital. That night, Brooke opened the patient management system with her restricted credentials and pulled up the pharmaceutical logs from memory. Blackwell had assumed she'd stop. He'd assumed fear would silence her. Instead, he'd made her angry, and angry was a clarity most people couldn't afford. The shipping manifests didn't match. 50 units of cisatracurium marked as distributed to the ICU. But the patient charts showed usage for only 32 units. 18 units missing. Redirected. Off books. She photographed the screen with her hospital-issued phone, knowing he probably had access to that too, not caring anymore. Let him know she was looking. Let him know she'd seen what was underneath the professional veneer. She navigated to the John Doe patient's chart. The green beret. The one with her name inked on his arm. She zoomed in on the coordinates tattooed below her name, latitude and longitude etched in the skin in precise military format. Her hands moved across the keyboard without hesitation, pulling up a map application on her phone. The coordinates placed the location in Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province. The extraction point. The spot where a soldier had been waiting to be picked up by helicopter and she'd had to carry him 3 miles because the LZ was compromised. The spot where she'd left a part of herself in the dust. The green beret had been in her unit. And somehow, impossibly, he'd ended up in this hospital. In this ICU. Under Blackwell's control. That's when the real weight settled across her shoulders. This wasn't random. This wasn't coincidence. Blackwell had chosen her for something. He'd tested her with the file room. He'd watched her reaction. And now he was playing a game with moves she didn't fully understand yet. She closed the applications and clocked out at 6:30 a.m. The staff meeting happened on a Tuesday in conference room B. 20 colleagues seated around the long table are nurses, residents, 2 physician assistants, the department chief. Brooke arrived and stood near the back, coffee cup in hand. She wasn't sitting. Blackwell always noticed things like that. Standing meant less committed. Standing meant ready to flee. She'd learned that much about human psychology. Blackwell stood at the head of the table wearing a navy blazer that probably cost more than Brooke's monthly rent. His voice was warm when he began the meeting. Professional. Collegial. He reviewed quarterly metrics. He praised the team's response times. He spoke about excellence and standards. Then his eyes found her. Nurse Sullivan. He smiled. Since you're so eager to expand your access to clinical information, I think it's time we reviewed some basic competencies. For everyone's benefit. Her colleagues shifted. A junior resident looked at the table. One of the pair suddenly became very interested in her iPad. Walk me through triage protocol for a penetrating chest wound. His voice had changed. The warmth had evaporated. Now it was the voice of a man delivering a judgment. Start from assessment. Brooke took a slow breath. Her hands remained steady on her coffee cup. She'd answered harder questions in far worse conditions. She'd done triage with rounds coming in hot and medevac helicopters inbound and blood on her uniform. She could do this. Airway assessment first. Her voice was quiet. Professional. Patent and uncompromised. Assume it's partially obstructed. Prepare for emergency airway management. Assess for tension pneumothorax. Needle decompression at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line if indicated. She paused. Sipped her coffee. Establish for access. Type and cross. Prepare for immediate surgical intervention. And if the patient goes into cardiac arrest? Depends on mechanism. Penetrating chest wound with arrest suggests hemorrhagic shock. Reboa balloon catheter for aortic clamping if the patient reaches the OR. Or emergency thoracotomy if we're pre-hospital. The room had gone very quiet. Blackwell's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Most people wouldn't have noticed. Brooke noticed everything. She watched him process the fact that she'd answered flawlessly. That she knew procedures most ICU nurses would never perform. That her knowledge base extended into trauma surgery and field medicine. Perhaps you should review your fundamentals anyway, he said finally. She didn't flinch. She set her coffee cup down on the nearest chair. My fundamentals are solid, doctor. He stared at her. The room held its breath. Then he turned back to the department chief and continued the meeting, dismissing her with his attention the way a predator dismisses prey that's proven to be too large to hunt. Two residents exchanged smirks. One leaned over and whispered something to his colleague. They were young. They didn't understand yet that the people who survived pressure were the ones who didn't break under it. Brooke stood for the remaining 40 minutes of the meeting without moving. 3 days later, she was waiting for the elevator on the main floor when Blackwell emerged from the stairwell. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second. He'd been waiting. Not coincidence. He knew her schedule now. Knew her patterns. The elevator doors slid open. She stepped forward. His arm shot out, blocking her path. The door slid shut again. He leaned close. Close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and aggressive. Nurses who don't know their place tend to find themselves unemployed. His voice was pitched low, meant only for her. I'd hate to see you lose everything over curiosity. Brooke stared straight ahead. Not at the elevator. Not at him. At the space 3 feet beyond both of them where nothing existed yet. She breathed slowly. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the accumulated muscle memory of a woman who'd been trained to operate under fire, and every cell in her body was screaming to move. She stepped around his arm without a word. Didn't use the elevator. Took the stairs instead, moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd already survived worse than a threat. Her footsteps echoed down the concrete stairwell. She didn't accelerate. Didn't hurry. Just descended with the kind of steady purpose that suggested she knew something he didn't. By that evening, another notice appeared on her phone. Your assignment has been modified. Effective immediately, you have been recommended for transfer to Whitmore Clinic, Rural Healthcare Facility, Macon County. 2-hour commute. This is a significant opportunity for professional growth in underserved communities. The message included a smiley face emoji. Blackwell's signature move, the warmth that made the knife easier to slide between the ribs. Brooke sat in her car in the parking garage, hands on the steering wheel again, breathing through her nose. The engine was off. The lights were dimming. Somewhere above her, in an office on the 5th floor, Dr. Blackwell was picking up his phone to make calls. She could feel the momentum building. The isolation was accelerating. Within a week, she'd be removed from Mercy General entirely. Within 2 weeks, there would be inquiries into her background. Within a month, she'd be unemployed. He was competent. That was the thing that terrified most people about men like Blackwell. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't brutal in a way that left evidence. He was surgical. He was precise. He was a man who understood that the best way to eliminate a threat was to make sure nobody believed the threat had ever existed in the first place. But he'd made one mistake. He'd shown her the file with the coordinates. He'd let her see the green beret with her name on his skin. He'd demonstrated that he knew something about her past, which meant someone had talked. Someone had made a call. Someone had opened doors that should have stayed locked. And that meant there was a thread. And threads could be pulled. Brooke pulled out her phone and opened a secure email application she'd kept dormant for 2 years. The kind of application that routed through servers in countries that didn't care about hospital networks or civilian surveillance. She typed a single message to a contact that no longer officially existed. I need to verify something. Helmand Province. Sanjin Valley. Extraction Point Alpha 7. Green Beret Designation Viper. Tattoo confirmation. Do you have records? She hit send and waited. The response came back in 43 seconds. Viper is alive. Brooke's hands went very still. Her locker door screamed when she opened it. The spray paint was still wet, metallic silver dripping like blood down the gunmetal gray. Lieutenant Liability. 3 words in letters 6 inches tall, and her entire body went rigid. She stared. Not trembling. Not breathing fast. Just staring at the name someone had pulled from a confidential patient file, a name that belonged only to people with clearance, people who had access to restricted records. Her jaw clenched once. She reached out and touched the paint with her fingertip. Still tacky. Still warm. The break room had 3 other nurses at 6:47 a.m. None of them looked up. They'd seen her open the locker. They knew what was written there. The silence was so thick you could operate in it, the kind of silence that comes from collective decision not to interfere. Brooke closed the locker without wiping the paint. Without saying anything. Without giving them the satisfaction. She walked to the sink, washed the silver off her fingers, and clocked in for the morning shift. Her hands were steady on the keyboard as she pulled up patient charts. Her voice was level when she reported to the charge nurse. I'm ready for rounds. But that wasn't the worst part. Dr. Blackwell was in his office on the 4th floor, door closed, phone pressed to his ear. The voice on the other end belonged to Harrison, board member Thomas Harrison, and Blackwell's tone was carefully calibrated, the voice of a man presenting a problem that needed solving by someone with power. The nurse I mentioned to you last week, Sullivan, I've become increasingly concerned about her judgment calls in the ICU. Blackwell leaned back in his leather chair, finger steepled. She's been making decisions that could expose us to liability. I need someone at the board level to know this. Discreetly. Before something happens that we can't walk back. Harrison's response crackled through the phone. Blackwell smiled. He didn't smile often. When he did, it looked like a predator testing the softness of its prey. I'll send documentation, Blackwell said. Everything official. Everything defensible. But I wanted to give you the context first. As a friend. He hung up without saying goodbye. That was the power move. Blackwell didn't say goodbye. He decided when conversations ended. 40 minutes later, his phone rang again. This time it was the HR director from Charleston, where Brooke had worked before Mercy General, before she walked away from military medicine, before she became a ghost in a city where nobody knew her name. Blackwell had kept her contact information from industry networks. He kept a lot of contact information. "This is Dr. Blackwell from Mercy General in Atlanta," he said, voice warm, conversational. "I'm calling about a former employee of yours, Brooke Sullivan. She's applying for a position here, and I want to make sure we have the full picture." The director's response came back confused. Sullivan wasn't applying for anything. She'd been there for 2 years. Blackwell didn't miss a beat. "Ah, I see. Well, I'm asking on behalf of our credentialing committee. We're doing deeper vetting. Have there been any performance concerns? Any incidents during her tenure with you? Anything we should know about her reliability?" The director hesitated, that microsecond pause that meant she was thinking about liability, HIPAA restrictions, what she could legally say without opening herself to a lawsuit. Blackwell had calculated for this hesitation. Hesitation meant he could fill the silence with his own narrative later. "No incidents that I'm aware of," the director finally said. "But she left quite suddenly, didn't she?" Blackwell's voice had a conversational lilt to it, like he was just making observations. Like he wasn't laying a landmine. "In the middle of a contract. That's unusual." More hesitation. "She cited personal reasons," the director said carefully. "Of course," Blackwell said. "Well, thank you for your time. Very helpful." He hung up and made a note, previous employer, voluntary termination, reasons unspecified. Pattern of leaving institutions? By noon, an external investigator named Marcus Webb had opened a manila folder in Blackwell's office. Webb specialized in personnel audits. Blackwell had used him before. Webb understood the game, find technicalities, find patterns, find anything that could be reframed as a liability. "I want you to go through her file with a microscope," Blackwell said. "Look for protocol deviations, missed signatures, any shift where she deviated from standard procedure. Any incident report, no matter how minor. Any complaint, even from patients. Build me a timeline of poor judgment." Webb nodded. He'd been paid $8,000 to do exactly this. "How aggressive." "Professional," Blackwell said. "But thorough. I need documentation. Real documentation. Not implications." That afternoon, Blackwell called 2 more board members, Patricia Chen from the Investment Committee and Richard Garrett from the Finance Subcommittee. Both of them had benefited when Blackwell had quietly helped cover budget overruns that would have triggered board audits. Both of them remembered. Both of them answered on the first ring when his assistant said he needed to speak with them. "I'm concerned about a nursing staff member," he told them, using the same careful language, the same concerned physician tone. "It's early in the process, but I wanted to make sure the hospital is protected. I'll be sending over documentation to leadership. I wanted you to have context." By 1:30 p.m., the paper trail was laid. Board members knew there was a problem. The external investigator was building a file. Her previous employer had been primed to confirm a pattern of instability. All of it was legal. All of it was deniable. All of it was war. Brooke didn't know any of this yet. She was 2 floors below, in the ICU, where the John Doe patient, the one with her name tattooed on his forearm, was being prepped for a routine procedure. A ventriculostomy. Simple. 30 minutes. Drain the fluid building up in his skull, and the intracranial pressure would drop. He'd wake up clearer. Maybe he'd remember her face. Maybe. The OR board in the hallway showed the assignment at 1,400 hours. Dr. Blackwell listed as attending. Brooke's name was there for support staff. She'd been his primary nurse for 6 weeks. She'd turned the patient every 2 hours, monitored his pupils for sign of herniation, charted his neurological status with the precision of someone who understood that numbers were the language between life and death. She approached Dr. Blackwell outside the OR prep area. Her voice was steady. Her hands were at her sides. No pleading in her posture. "Sir, I've been his primary nurse for 6 weeks. I should be in that room." Not a request. A statement of fact. Blackwell didn't look up from the surgical checklist. His voice was surgical, cutting. "Your judgment is currently under review. I won't risk a patient's safety to accommodate your ego." He said it loud enough for 3 other staff members to hear. He said it like it was documented fact instead of pure fiction. The poison was the casualness of it, the way he delivered cruelty wrapped in professional concern. Brooke's jaw clenched. Her hands remained still. She turned and walked toward the recovery bay 3 floors below, where she'd be assigned to post-op monitoring, where she'd be as far from that operating room as hospital geography allowed. Every step down felt like a calculation. Every step felt like surrender. At 1:30 p.m., her phone buzzed. A text from Jenny, the OR nurse who'd become her closest ally at Mercy General, probably because Jenny didn't ask questions and didn't judge. "Something's wrong. His rhythm is off. Blackwell won't listen." Brooke stopped moving. The phone felt heavy in her hand. Hospital protocol was clear, each nurse stayed in her assigned area. Each department had its chain of command. Crossing those lines meant insubordination. Meant accusations of boundary violations. Meant exactly the ammunition Blackwell needed. She pulled the challenge coin from her scrub pocket. Tarnished silver, unmarked except for the unit number etched into the edge. 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company. Only operators recognized those numbers. Only people who'd worn the uniform understood what they meant. The coin was cold in her palm. She traced the edge with her thumb. Every protocol said stay. Every regulation said wait for chain of command. Every rule said protect yourself. She put the coin back and walked toward the stairwell. The alarm started screaming at 1:47 p.m. High-pitched, rhythmic, the sound that meant a human heart was no longer beating in any pattern the machine could recognize. Brooke was already moving, up 2 flights, through the corridor, past 3 startled residents, straight toward the code blue that was erupting in OR3. The doors burst open under her hands. The patient was on the table, monitors screaming, the surgical team frozen in the posture of people watching catastrophe unfold in slow motion. Blackwell stood at the head of the table, his hands raised slightly, the posture of someone who'd lost control and was pretending it hadn't happened. Brooke's voice cut through every alarm in that room, not loud, but carrying the weight of authority that only came from someone who'd held a dying soldier and refused to let go. "Crack his chest. Now." Blackwell's head snapped toward her. "You're not authorized." "Chest," she said. Not a question. Not a request. An order delivered by someone who'd trained for this, who'd done this under fire, whose hands had muscle memory written in 3 tours through Helmand Province. The surgical resident was already moving. Scalpel flashed. Ribs cracked open with a wet sound of bone separating. Brooke was there before anyone could stop her, hands in the chest cavity, finding the heart, beginning direct cardiac massage, her palms against the muscle, feeling it resist then respond, willing it back to life through sheer force of hands that had held people together on desert dirt. The monitor showed nothing. Then a flutter. Then another. "Epi," she said. 1 milligram 4, push now. The room moved like a single organism. The anesthesiologist pushed the syringe. Brooke continued compression, mechanical, precise, relentless. Her hands were steady. Her focus was absolute. Everything else fell away. After 11 minutes, the monitor showed sinus rhythm. A heartbeat. Real. Sustained. The patient's chest rising on his own with the ventilator's assistance. The room went dead silent. Brooke stepped back, hands dripping. She didn't look at Blackwell. She didn't acknowledge anyone. She turned and walked toward the scrub sink, where she began washing the blood away with the methodical care of someone who'd done this before, who understood that saving a life and saving your own were sometimes different equations. Behind her, she heard Blackwell's voice, but it sounded distant. Thin. Like air escaping from something that had been pressurized too long. The ventriculostomy was supposed to be routine. Morning rounds, elevated intracranial pressure in the green beret patient, fluid buildup that needed drainage through a small burr hole in the skull. Straightforward neurosurgery. Dr. Blackwell stood at the bedside with his attending, speaking in that measured voice he used when the news cameras weren't rolling, discussing placement angles and drainage rates as if the man on the stretcher wasn't the same soldier Brooke had carried 6 kilometers through enemy fire. She had no business being in that operating room. Her access was restricted. Her file was flagged. But Blackwell had assigned her anyway, assigned her to assist with a procedure she wasn't cleared to touch, as if handing her just enough rope to hang herself with was better sport than simply waiting for her to fail. The surgery began at 0800 hours. The patient was prepped, draped, conscious enough to follow commands but sedated enough that the pain was theoretical. Brooke positioned herself on the right side of the surgical bed, hand steady as she passed instruments, retractors, speculums, the small ventricular catheter that would draw fluid from inside the brain. The attending worked with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times. No complications. No alarms. Just the soft beeping of the monitors and the whisper of the ventilator keeping the patient's lungs inflating and deflating like a metronome marking time. 20 minutes. 30. The catheter was placed. The drainage was flowing. The attending nodded to Blackwell. Almost done. That's when the monitor's rhythm changed. It wasn't a flat line. It was worse. It was a heart that started skipping, arrhythmia, the electrical impulses misfiring like a car engine sputtering in cold weather. The attending looked up. The surgical nurse's hand froze mid-reach for a syringe. The monitor's beeping became irregular, then frantic, then a sound like someone tapping out a panicked Morse code that spelled out one word, trouble. The patient's oxygen saturation dropped. 78%. 72. The attending barked for EpiPen, for crash cart, for someone to get the attending cardiologist from Trauma Bay 3. But the cardiologist wasn't in Trauma Bay 3. The cardiologist was in the OR next door with a collapsed lung, 3 minutes minimum away. Maybe 5 if the traffic in the hallway backed up. The heart rate plummeted. 60. 52. The attending's voice tightened, "We're losing him. Get me a crash cart now." The cart arrived in 40 seconds. Defibrillator pads, medications, airway equipment, a mobile armory for fighting death when death decided to come for you right there on the operating table. The attending shocked the patient once. The body convulsed. The monitor stayed chaotic. Shocked again. Nothing. The attending's jaw clenched. He was good. Competent. But competence meant nothing when the heart decided to stop listening. Blackwell stood at the foot of the bed, arms crossed, watching. Not helping. Just watching, as if he were observing a medical school lecture rather than a patient hemorrhaging away in front of him. Brooke had spent 2 years trying to forget what this felt like. The moment when the training superseded the civilian job title. The moment when the nurse became something else entirely. Pain was information. Information was survival. The patient's chest cavity was already open from the ventriculostomy prep. She saw the problem instantly. The heart wasn't beating, it was fibrillating, a useless electrical storm with no coordinated contractions to push blood through the body. The brain was already being starved of oxygen. In another 2 minutes, permanent damage. 3 minutes, death. The surgical resident was frozen, looking at Blackwell for direction, but Blackwell wasn't looking at the resident. He was looking at Brooke, and his expression had hardened into something that resembled recognition mixed with rage. Resuscitative thoracotomy, Brooke said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact, delivered in a voice that had no trace of the deferential nurse who had been passing instruments 5 seconds ago. I need access. The surgical resident stammered something incoherent. The attending was reaching for the defibrillator pads again, running through the standard ACLS protocol, but standard protocol didn't work when the electrical current needed to reach the heart from the inside, when the only chance was to make the heart move manually, to force it to pump blood through sheer physical pressure applied by hands that knew how to do it. Brooke grabbed the rib spreaders from the crash cart. She positioned herself at the patient's left side, the left anterolateral thoracotomy position, the same position she had assumed in Helmand Province during a mass casualty situation when a Marine with a sucking chest wound had needed surgical intervention 50 kilometers from the nearest operating room. The muscle memory didn't fade. It just waited. Her hands moved on their own. She cut. The scalpel parted tissue and muscle with a sound like fabric tearing. Blood welled up immediately, dark and urgent. A nurse pressed gauze to the incision, but Brooke was already positioning the rib spreaders, the heavy steel instrument that looked like a medieval torture device but worked like a miracle when a chest cavity needed to open. She twisted the handle. The rib spread. There was the pericardium, the sac surrounding the heart. One more cut. One more second. And then the heart was exposed, sitting in front of her, not beating, just lying there like something dead. She thrust both hands into the chest cavity. The blood was warm. The tissue was slippery. She wrapped her fingers around the heart and began to compress it manually, the way a hand pump works, squeezing and releasing, forcing blood through the coronary arteries and into the brain, buying time, buying seconds, buying the possibility of a miracle. The surgical team scrambled. Someone shouted for internal defibrillation pads. The monitor stayed flat. 10 seconds. 30. Her forearms were burning. The blood soaked through her gloves and into her scrubs, warm and thick and specific. 1 minute. The heart hadn't moved on its own. She kept compressing. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. She had done this before. Not in a hospital. But muscle memory was muscle memory. A nurse pressed the defibrillator pads against the heart. Brooke pulled her hands back just enough. The shock rippled through the organ. The monitor didn't change. Brooke went back to compressions. The heart was like a failing engine, it needed to remember how to work. 2 minutes. 3. The attending watched her with an expression that combined awe and something darker, something like witnessing a priest suddenly speak in tongues. Blackwell's face had gone grey. He opened his mouth to say something, to order her to stop, to pull her away from the patient, but the words came out strangled. Call it. This is over. Brooke didn't look at him. She didn't break rhythm. 5 minutes. 8. Her shoulders burned. Her hands were slick with blood, but her grip didn't slip. She had saved 3 people in Helmand Province this way. She had also watched 2 people die in her hands. That was the contract you made with this particular procedure. You were committing to 11 minutes of effort, of exhaustion, of fighting against physics and biology and probability. If the heart didn't restart by then, you let go. 11 minutes. Then, something changed. A flutter on the monitor. A single spike in the sea of flatness. Another flutter. A beat. A hesitation. Another beat. The heart contracted under her hands, tentative at first, like something waking from a deep sleep, and then stronger, finding its rhythm, remembering how to work. The monitor's beeping became regular. The oxygen saturation began to climb. 85%. 90%. The surgical team moved in instinctively, handing her sutures, beginning to close. She stepped back, hands covered to the elbows in blood, breathing hard, her scrubs transformed into something that looked more like a combat scene than surgical attire. 20 minutes later, she was standing in Dr. Blackwell's office. Security waited outside the door. She knew what was coming. The irony was exquisite. She had just saved a patient using unorthodox but absolutely effective emergency protocol, and it had cost her everything. Blackwell sat behind his desk, composed now, his expression the mirror of a man who had just watched his strategy collapse and was already calculating the next move. "You violated direct orders," he said, his voice smooth as a blade. Performed a procedure outside your scope. No attending authorization. Endangered the patient with catastrophic protocol violation. She said nothing. You're terminated. Effective immediately. She handed him her badge. It made a soft sound as it landed on his desk, plastic and metal and finality. She signed the termination papers. The security guards escorted her through the hallway where staff members watched with expressions that ranged from confusion to admiration to fear. Nobody stopped her. Nobody spoke. The locker room was empty. She changed out of the bloody scrubs, her movements automatic, muscle memory at work again. Her clothes were in the bottom locker, folded and waiting. She reached into her bag and found the tarnished challenge coin at the very bottom, the metal worn smooth from 2 years of carrying it, its unit number barely visible in the fluorescent light. She closed her fist around it. 3 a.m. found her in an empty diner on the outskirts of Atlanta. The kind of place that stayed open because the world never stopped needing coffee, even at hours when decent people were sleeping. She sat in a booth with cracked vinyl seats, staring at her ghostly reflection in the window. The coffee had gone cold an hour ago. The coin rested in her palm, and she turned it over and over, watching the light catch on the worn edges. She had walked away from the Navy to escape the nightmares, to hide in a place where nobody knew what she was, to become someone small and safe and unremarkable. She had failed at that. The nightmares had followed anyway. And now she had nothing, no job, no cover, no reason to stay in Atlanta except for the strange gravity of a soldier with her name on his skin. The rain came around 4 a.m., hammering the parking lot with a sound like applause, or judgment, or both. She sat in the car with the engine off, the coin in her left hand, the challenge coin that only an operator would recognize, that connected her to a unit and a war and a life she had tried to bury. She wondered if everyone who tried to disappear ended up in diners at 3 a.m., staring at reflections and wondering how they got lost. She wondered if the Green Beret would survive. She wondered if walking away from the military was the bravest thing she'd ever done or the biggest mistake. She had no idea what was about to happen at noon. The sound came first, rotors, heavy and low, cutting through the morning like a knife through silk. Brooke heard it from the diner parking lot, from the car she'd been sitting in for 8 hours, and knew immediately what it meant. Helicopter. Military grade. Close. She turned the ignition key with hands that weren't quite steady. Drove back toward Mercy General because there was nowhere else to go, because the coin in her pocket had stopped being a secret and had become something else, a beacon, maybe, or a countdown timer that had just hit 0. 3 black SUVs pulled into the emergency bay at 1,145 hours. The rotor wash shook the windows of the ICU ward where nurses scattered like leaves. The helicopter landed on the helipad with a precision that spoke of pilots who had done this 1,000 times in 1,000 desert towns where precision meant survival. The doors of the first SUV opened in unison. A Navy captain in dress white stepped out, the kind of uniform you didn't see outside of formal ceremonies, and his bearing made it clear this was not a formal ceremony. 2 armed guards flanked him, their presence transforming the hospital lobby into something that resembled a security checkpoint. The captain's boot falls echoed on tile. His eye swept the lobby until they found the reception desk. "I need to speak with Lieutenant Commander Sullivan immediately." Not a request. A command. The receptionist's face went blank with confusion. We have a Brooke Sullivan, but she's not. Her name and rank. Now. Dr. Blackwell emerged from the administrative wing at that exact moment, mid-sentence with a news crew about Mercy General's commitment to excellence in patient care. He stopped mid-word. His eyes found the captain. The captain's eyes found him. The air pressure in the lobby changed, the way it changes when a storm is moving in. "Where is Viper?" the captain asked, and the question hung in the air like a test of the universe itself. The admiral emerged from the second SUV with the deliberation of a man accustomed to controlling rooms simply by his presence. For stars gleamed on his dress whites like warnings. He moved through the automatic doors and the lobby fell silent, the kind of silence that comes from the sudden recognition that something significant was occurring, that whatever was about to happen would change the geometry of this place forever. Carl, the hospital's veteran security guard, 62 years old, Army infantry, the kind of man who had nodded to Brooke in the hallways without judgment because he recognized something in her that most people missed, suddenly straightened to attention. His spine aligned with the precision of someone muscle memory had never forgotten. His voice, when it came, was the voice of a parade ground and a salute and a lifetime of service. "Lieutenant Commander Brooke Sullivan, United States Navy, sir." The gasps came from multiple directions at once. A nurse's hand flew to her mouth. A resident's clipboard clattered to the floor. Someone whispered the words Lieutenant Commander, and those two words traveled through the lobby like electricity through copper wire. The Admiral produced a service record, official documentation, stamped and verified and beyond dispute. He began reading aloud, 3 combat deployments, Helmand Province. Embedded with Marine and Special Forces units. He paused. The staff reaction rippled like a wave. Confusion becoming comprehension. The quiet nurse with steady hands had been somewhere that most of them had only seen on the news, if at all. 2 Navy crosses for Valor under fire. Another pause. Longer this time. A Navy cross wasn't something you got for showing up. It was something you earned when everything went wrong and you didn't. The news camera, which had been filming Blackwell's interview about excellence, swung around to capture the Admiral's words. 15 lives saved in active combat zones. Someone in the back let out a sound between a laugh and a sob. Carl's eyes were wet. The Admiral's gaze was steady, impassive, the gaze of a man who had seen enough of war to understand what it meant to see someone who had seen the same things. Call sign, Viper. The elevator dinged. Orderlies wheeled out the green beret, the patient who had been John Doe when he arrived, now conscious, neck brace still in place, his eyes tracking the Admiral with the clarity of someone whose brain had healed enough to understand language, to understand weight, to understand consequence. He lifted his tattooed forearm, the one bearing her name, and his voice came out rough from disuse. "She carried me 6 clicks through hell when everyone else said to leave me. Took fire 3 times. Never once stopped moving. 10 full seconds of absolute silence. Someone's phone was recording. The silence lasted long enough for everyone present to understand that this was real, that this was happening, that the nurse they had mocked had just been unveiled as something entirely different from what they thought they knew. The Admiral's gaze shifted to Dr. Blackwell. There was something in that shift that resembled the moment before an avalanche, the instant of suspension before gravity wins. "You fired this officer." The moment after the Admiral's question hung in the air like a held breath, Dr. Blackwell's face shifted. Not dramatically. Just a tightening at the corners of his mouth, a calculation flickering behind his eyes as he understood, with the certainty of a man watching his constructed world collapse in real time, that the Navy captain wasn't here for a routine inquiry. That this was something far worse than a protocol complaint. His hand reached for his phone before he'd finished processing the thought, muscle memory taking over the way it always did when control slipped, call the board members who owed him, activate the network he'd spent 8 years building, neutralize the threat before it metastasized. He stepped into his office on the 4th floor, door closing with the soft click of someone who was still certain he could manage this, still operating under the assumption that institutional power moved the way he'd always moved it. He was wrong about that. The first call took 47 seconds. Board member Harrison picked up on the second ring, and Blackwell's voice emerged smooth as always, calibrated and reasonable. "We have a situation. The Navy is conducting an inquiry into a personnel matter. I need you to understand that Lieutenant Sullivan violated protocol during a surgical emergency by proceeding with an unauthorized intervention. The attending physician was not present. The procedure was," Harrison interrupted him, and Blackwell heard something he'd never heard in that man's voice before, uncertainty mixed with something that sounded like fear. "I can't help you with this, Mark. Not anymore. My lawyers are reviewing my relationship with your pharmaceutical trials. I suggest you speak with counsel." The line went dead. Blackwell called board member Torres next. Same pattern. Different words, same outcome. By the third call, To HR Director Mitchell in Charleston, he understood that the network wasn't a network anymore. It was a liability. Mitchell had already prepared a statement. Voluntary separation with full honors. Mental health leave. He'd authorized her resignation personally. The implication was clear: Brooke Sullivan had left the system with the hospital's blessing, and if Blackwell suggested otherwise, Mitchell would have documentation proving he'd pressured her under false pretenses. Blackwell hung up and sat in his office chair, the leather creaking under his weight. Through the window, he could see 3 black SUVs in the emergency bay parking lot. Military precision in the vehicle placement. He'd served in the Navy once, before medical school, and he recognized the staging pattern of a formal removal. That was when the external investigator's email arrived. Janet Torres, the woman he'd hired, the woman he'd paid $2,000 to find something, anything, he could use to discredit Brooke's record. Her message was 7 sentences long. She'd found his pressure emails. She documented his requests for a predetermined outcome. She was submitting her findings to the state medical board. She was also notifying the FBI. The attachment was a PDF of their entire email correspondence, flagged for investigation under 18 U.S.C. 1513, obstruction of justice. Blackwell's breathing changed at that point. Not dramatically. Just shallower. Faster. The kind of breathing a body does when it recognizes danger but hasn't yet accepted it. Security came for him at 3:17 p.m. He was still sitting in his office chair, the emergency room sounds filtering up through the floor, monitors beeping, overhead pages announcing arrivals, the constant mechanical pulse of a hospital in operation. The 2 officers were professional about it. Respectful. They escorted him downstairs where a crowd had gathered. Staff members whose careers he'd shaped and whose loyalty he'd assumed was transactional, standing in clusters with their phones out, cameras recording as he passed. The Navy captain was still in the lobby. The admiral stood beside the reception desk, reading from a document with the cadence of someone performing a formal ceremony. Blackwell caught fragments. Pharmaceutical diversion. Off-label trials without informed consent. Falsification of research protocols. Intimidation of medical personnel. The admiral's voice was precise as a laser, each word cutting deeper than the last, and Blackwell understood in that moment that he'd miscalculated at every critical juncture. He'd assumed the system protected its own. He'd assumed that a decorated career and board membership and research funding meant institutional armor. He'd assumed wrong. The hospital board chairwoman, Margaret Chen, stepped forward from the gathered crowd holding her phone. The board voted unanimously 3 hours ago, she said, her voice calm but absolutely final. Your contract is terminated for cause. You're to vacate your office and the hospital grounds within the hour. Security will escort you. The cameras captured it all. Local news. National outlets picking up the story within minutes. The image would replay for weeks, a man in an Armani suit being escorted out by security, the Navy captain standing with his arms crossed, the admiral's face betraying nothing but absolute certainty. Blackwell tried to speak. This is a civilian hospital. You have no authority, the admiral cut him off without raising his voice. I'm not here in an official capacity, Doctor. I'm here as a brother whose sibling's life was saved by an officer you attempted to destroy. That's all the authority I require. The unraveling happened over 7 days. Board member Harrison resigned under pressure when financial audits revealed his consulting contracts with Blackwell's research trials, a pattern of payments that looked less like compensation and more like payoffs. His law firm distanced itself immediately. The Bar Association opened a preliminary inquiry. HR Director Mitchell released a statement that Brooke Sullivan's separation from her previous hospital in Charleston had been entirely voluntary, authorized for mental health purposes, with full honors and excellent references. The implication was clear: Blackwell had lied about her record. He'd manipulated her history to justify her removal from Mercy General. Janet Torres, the external investigator, submitted her complete findings to the state medical board. Blackwell's pressure emails. His requests for a predetermined outcome. his willingness to fabricate findings to remove a threat. The board received the report on a Tuesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, Blackwell's medical license was suspended pending a formal hearing. The pharmaceutical diversion investigation accelerated. 83 patients identified who'd participated in off-label trials without informed consent. 17 separate research protocols running simultaneously without proper institutional oversight. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in redirected inventory documented in the very files Brooke had glimpsed that night in the restricted room. The FBI sent 2 agents. They interviewed Blackwell for 4 hours in a conference room on the second floor of Mercy General while news vans circled the parking lot. He'd hired a lawyer by then, a criminal defense attorney with a platinum Rolex and a reputation for expensive failures. But even the lawyer could see there was no defense here. The evidence was documentary. The intent was clear. The damage was measurable in patient records and missing consent forms and trial protocols that looked less like research and more like experimentation. On day 7, Master Sergeant Danny Hale, the Green Beret whose name was tattooed on Brooke's shoulder, whose life she'd saved when she performed cardiac massage for 11 minutes while surgeons froze, was discharged from the ICU. He was awake. Memory returning in fragments. His older brother, Rear Admiral James Hale, arrived that morning from Naval Station Norfolk, where he commanded a carrier group with 8,000 sailors under his authority. James was a tall man with Blackwell's same build but absolutely nothing else in common. His presence moved through space like a controlled detonation, precision and purpose, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse. He stood beside Danny's hospital bed as news cameras recorded. Danny's voice was still weak from the intubation, but his words were clear. "I got her name tattooed so I'd never forget her face. The TBI took my memory of that day, the extraction, the firefight, all of it. But not this. Not her." He lifted his arm, showing the tattoo that had haunted Brooke through every shift. "She saved my life. Not once. Twice. Protocol be damned." Rear Admiral Hale stepped forward, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a man who controlled nuclear weapons and answered directly to the Joint Chiefs. "When my brother went into cardiac arrest and I received notification that a lieutenant commander had violated protocol to perform emergency resuscitation, I made inquiries. Those inquiries led me to understand that Dr. Blackwell had engineered her termination specifically because she'd discovered his pharmaceutical scheme. That he'd used institutional authority to remove a threat. The Navy doesn't take kindly to that pattern." The cameras panned to Blackwell, who was watching from the hallway with his lawyer. His face had the appearance of someone watching his future calcify in real time. The Medical Licensing Board suspended Blackwell's license on day 9. His research funding was rescinded within 48 hours. His professional references went silent, colleagues who'd praised him 6 months earlier now refusing to return calls. His name began appearing in medical ethics seminars as a cautionary tale. Blackwell's case became the reference point for institutional corruption, for how power could corrupt medical judgment, for how systems protected their own until external authority intervened. The hospital's insurance company opened a separate investigation. 14 additional patients filed complaints about undisclosed research participation. Lawyers were hired. Settlements were negotiated. Blackwell's personal assets began moving toward liability coverage. By day 30, he was teaching CPR at Valdosta Community College. $15 an hour. Classroom in a strip mall next to a tax preparation service and a vape shop. Teaching chest compressions to pharmacy students and respiratory therapists who had no idea they were being instructed by a man who'd once controlled pharmaceutical policy at a 200-bed hospital. He'd moved his family to a rental house 12 miles outside the city. His wife had taken the kids to her mother's in Savannah. She was filing divorce papers. His medical license investigation would continue for another 18 months before the state board issued its final ruling, revocation, pending appeal. He appealed. He lost. He appealed again. He lost again. Teaching CPR for minimum wage became his permanent career trajectory. But that wasn't where Brooke's story ended. Not even close. At 3 a.m. on the 31st day after Blackwell's termination, she was still sitting in that empty diner on the outskirts of Atlanta, the same diner where she'd spent the night after being fired, staring at her ghostly reflection in the window. Except now she wasn't alone. Carl, the security guard, sat across from her with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. "I went back to the hospital," he said quietly. "Saw that your locker's been repaired. They repainted it." Brooke nodded. She'd already gone by and photographed the damage before maintenance fixed it. Documentation of what happened to anyone who saw too much, who wouldn't play the game, who chose a patient's life over institutional politics. "The Admiral's still there," Carl continued, "overseeing the investigation. He comes by every morning at 0600 hours. Military precision. Asks about you." Brooke didn't answer. She turned the tarnished challenge coin over in her fingers, the same coin she'd carried through Helmand Province, through the Phi base at San Gin Valley, through 2 years of hiding in Atlanta's night shifts. The coin had no inscription except a unit number visible only to those who'd served in 1st SFOD Delta. Carl recognized it. "That's the real deal," he said softly. "Yeah," Brooke replied. "It always was." The next morning, Brooke walked into Mercy General's Human Resources office and found a letter waiting. Rehiring paperwork. Full restoration of her position. Back pay calculated for every shift she'd been kept from working. An apology from the hospital board that attempted to be more than it was, words trying to heal damage that words couldn't touch. But beneath the apology was something else. A job offer. Not as a staff nurse. As Director of Clinical Ethics and Patient Safety. The Admiral's recommendation. The board's unanimous approval. $42,000 annually, 3 weeks vacation, tuition reimbursement for any certification program she wanted. A position that had never existed before, created specifically because the hospital finally understood that competence could speak quietly and still be deadly, that protocols existed to protect patients and not institutions, that silence enabled abuse in the same way that speaking enabled its end. Brooke took the position. Not because of the money. Because she'd spent 2 years running from what she was, and the running had led her to save a Green Beret's life by ignoring everything the system told her to obey. The system had tried to destroy her for that choice. Instead, the system had collapsed. She'd never spoken loudly. She'd never demanded anything. She'd just done what was right when it mattered most, and the weight of that act had changed everything. Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs. Like and subscribe if you love stories about people who've been underestimated. Comment below if you've ever had someone doubt you and you proved them wrong. Let's get back to it.